trade routes. As I keep saying, it just seems such a simple thing, and yet we've ignored them for so long. And this floor mosaic from Byzantium and Islam is from a church in Jordan, which makes its money off moving goods from Alexandria to Antioch. And then from Antioch, it would move on to the center of Constantinople. And what I love about it is these little zigzags are you're looking through the gate of the city, down the streets with the colonnaded borders with the lintels, and then the shops would be behind them. And you've got a Christian site here. If this had been done several centuries earlier, all that would have been different was the cross. And where they are going is to Constantinople, New Rome, which will become, with the Ottoman conquest, still Constantinople, but the capital of the Ottoman Empire, and will actually not be legally named Istanbul until the establishment of the Turkish Republic in the early 20th century. And when you are there, what you would have seen, what we would have seen, coming from buildings that, if we were really lucky, were 5 stories tall, and there are certainly ones that height in Yemen, we would have seen the Church of Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia, which is near the football stadium, the Hippodrome, and right next to the Imperial Palace. And in the 6th century, the teams at an event in the Hippodrome riot, and they burned down a good deal of the city at the beginning of the 6th century. And when they burned down the city, one of the things that is badly damaged is the Church of Hagia Sophia that had been built in the 4th century. And the Emperor Justinian, whom we saw in the beginning, having first thought he would flee because he's living somewhere right there and the riots are somewhere right here, stays. And then he hires 2 great scholars, Artemius of Trials and Isidore, thank you, and Isidora of Miletus, to design a building which is unlike anything quite that scale before and will not be matched for 1,000 years. And when you enter it, the minarets would not have been there, so it would have looked like this great big pile of ascending semicircles, and you would have been inside of a space that could hold 3 Gothic cathedrals piled on top of each other before you reach the top of the dome. So when it is built, Procopius describes it as having a dome that appears to be let down on a golden chain from heaven. There's a legend that the builders themselves asked Justinian to stop it because it's going to fall down, that the Archangel Michael protects it. What is certainly true is that when Brunelleschi and Sinon 1,000 years later each are able to build a building not as tall but with the same width across the dome, that they record that they have built something that matches or surpasses Hagia Sophia. So it's not something that stays in the backlands and nobody knows about it. And when the Ottoman Turks take Constantinople in 1453, this is what they turn into their victory mosque. So it goes from being one of the great churches of the Christian world to being the mosque of the Ottoman Muslim world. And in the first generations after it, it becomes the style of Ottoman mosque. So what you're looking at here, not that far away from it, is a very similar building, which is actually the burial mosque of one of the greatest of the Ottoman rulers, Suleiman the Magnificent. And after him, in these little domes, a number of the leading Ottoman rulers are buried at the edge of Hagia Sophia. So it is a burial mosque for the rulers of the Ottoman Empire. It is the victory mosque of the Ottoman Empire. And as I'm sure many of you know today, it is still fought over whether it will become a mosque again, because Ataturk, in establishing the Turkish Republic and being extremely irritated with the failure of the Ottoman dynasty, turns it into a museum. And so what he has done is taken the sacred side of the Ottoman rulers and made it neutral. And those who are intensely interested in reviving. The Ottoman world want it returned to being a mosque, and those who are Orthodox Christians do not want to forget the millennium that it was a Christian church. But you have to just think of what it is like to come there. We know in about the year 1000, when the Rus come from the north and they're looking for a better religion because they have a kind of animistic religion, they look at the Catholic Church of Rome, they look at Judaism, they come to Constantinople and write back to their ruler that they don't know whether they're in heaven or on earth when they go to a service there, and so the religion that they should take, which remains the religion of the Russian world, is Orthodoxy. So it must have just been an incredibly overwhelming thing. And Justinian and Theodora are here, as they would have looked when he has built Hagia Sophia and consecrated it in 537. These images are political propaganda in the western capital of the Byzantine Empire, which is Ravenna, Italy, which has a good harbor. And by the 6th century, the harbor in Rome itself has become full of silt, so the good boats deep boats cannot really go there. And the state has moved to what, if you visit, it looks very much like Williamsburg. It's a tiny little thing now with very pretty places. And what is amazing about these images is that they are in the apse of a church. So you are coming into a church for a Christian service, and when you look toward the altar, what you are seeing is the rulers of the Orthodox Byzantine state, and the church was built in its, as it was being finished for the rulers of Ravenna, who have just fallen to Justinian, and who are Christian, but they're the wrong Christians. They're Ostrogothic, and they are Arian Christians. So this is not just a George III on his horse, we rule America. This is a very big statement. We rule in the name of this faith. If you're going to do well, you're going to agree with us. Theodora has the three magi, and she's under a shell just like the Torah niche at Dura Europos. And Justinian's soldiers have the Cairo that the Constantine's soldiers are supposed to have painted on their shields when they are victorious at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. So it is very much tied to the Christianization. But what's also interesting is she's not in the church. She's getting ready to enter it, go through this tied back curtain. So in the courtyard, there's a fountain with water, which we don't think of with Christian churches, but do with mosque. And what I love is this little image of children playing on the camels is from the floor of their palace. And now you can see it in a little museum that the Austrians built that has a whole bazaar on top of it. But there are all these cute little children doing different things, and one of them is being led around on the camels that help with the trade to the east, and which, like the other things, are just so naturalistic that you don't necessarily think of them as being of the Christian era, and they're not Christian, they're good taste. And that last gasp of what is something that's like a late antique world will extend into the beginning of the 600s, into the first half of the 7th century, when the force that will arise that takes over much of this region, that of the Islamic world, comes to power. And the last emperor who is really important to this is perhaps this gentleman, the Emperor Heraclius, who may be being shown at the beginning of a gospel of, not the gospel, of the book of a wonderful person. Thank you. A book of Job. And he is the emperor who saves the true cross that the Persians who have reached the Mediterranean have taken from Jerusalem and taken to Ctesiphon. And in his first generation of rule from 610 is very successful at restoring the power to the west, to Byzantium. And then suddenly there is a force that comes out of nowhere, coming from Mecca, Medina. Nobody knows quite what they are. Their texts in the beginning think that they are another form of very iconoclastic fundamentalist Christians. and they don't actually realize in the beginning that they are a force that has another belief, and he will essentially have to retreat, giving up Syria and North Africa to these people, and protecting the heartland of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, and what we call Anatolia, or modern Turkey. What's interesting about Heraclius to me in this talk is, of course, he is a Byzantine, but he's also an Armenian. His father was one of the many, many Armenians that were very, very influential in the military of the Byzantine Empire. The military on the eastern side was largely Armenians, and his father was so successful that he controlled the Armenian theme, which is what in the end Heraclius uses to buffer against the Muslims, and then was made the head of the North African territories of the Byzantine Empire. So Heraclius will sail from essentially modern Tunisia to become emperor in Constantinople. And we don't really know how much he identifies in any way with his father's past. We don't know how much his father identifies with his father's past. We're not even deadly sure, but we now believe that his mother was also Armenian, which would suggest that he would have some idea about it, but we don't know all of it. A man named Walter Kagi is the best scholar on it. But what we do know about the Armenian world that they come from is that they are right on this border that we've been discussing between East and West. They are to the north, and they control the trade route that moves for the silks of China across what we call the Silk Road, when we mean those stops along the lower edge of the Russian stands. And they are torn between Christianity. They adapt Christianity as a state religion, which actually means, as with Ethiopia, that a small portion of its king becomes Christian at the very beginning of the 4th century. But they are largely not converted from the classical religions that we think about. They are converted from Zoroastrianism and from their own goddess Anahit. So in one of my favorite images, this is one of the earliest Armenian manuscript illuminations to survive, which, if you are reading a book translated around 1912, The Travels of Abu Sama, the Armenian, you will find in the very scholarly footnotes a very prominent scholar saying that the Armenians do not have illuminations before the 13th century because they're good Protestants, and so they don't have art. But these are actually somewhere in the 6th, 7th century, and it's showing the Persian priest-kings recognizing Christ as greater than them. So the three magi are not just people from the east, they are specifically the Zoroastrian priest-kings, even to the poses that they are standing in. And while it could be seen as just kind of a generic, well, they're to the east, what you're really looking at is another type of political propaganda. Christ has come, and he outranks those, the faith that the Persians had. This is done right as the Arabs are also wiping the Persians out. And then here you have the Archangel Gabriel, because we think of the three magi following the stars, but the tradition of the Armenian infancy gospel, which was not written in Armenian but only survives in an Armenian translation, is that they in fact were approached. First, the angel Gabriel tells the virgin she's going to have the Son of God, and then he goes out and collects the magi and brings them to the virgin. Here he's brought them there. And she, perhaps because she's holding the Christ child in a kind of a mandala, is recognizing that he is totally God and not of man, because that is the theological position of the Armenian church. And the Emperor Heraclius was not at a moment of great poverty, which is another traditional view of this material. He gives out, or somebody who knows him gives out, a whole set of very elaborate silver, very, very heavy, with a narrative of the youth of Christ. It's possible that there were more that were lost that showed more, not the use of Christ, use of David. They were found at the end of the 19th century when they were repairing a port across in northern Cyprus. So we assume that they were buried sometime in or after the age of Heraclius, because they've got silver stamps on the back that make it in his era, as people were fleeing, and that they expected to come back and collect them. And they just never were able to come back. So when we found them, as we all tend to do, the first thing was to say, well, they can't be Christian because they're too good. They have to be classical. And then it was hard to get rid of the fact that it is the story of David, and that makes it at least biblical. It's interesting to me that while they are certainly part of a Christian collection, because the jewelry that was found with them have crosses on them, there's nothing on them that makes them Christian. What the other plates show is an imperial figure, but not a specifically Christian one. So here is David and Goliath. And what's so really wonderful about this, you have to think it's the late 1800s. We're certain that Christians don't have good art. And suddenly you've got these discoveries in which these are just beautifully articulated bodies. They're as good as anything that classical art would have ever done. But the narrative isn't right. It ought to be something out of the Iliad. Instead, it's biblical. And you have at the top, this is the biggest central plate in the narrative, and not the central plate in terms of the plates that survive, a rather large David and comparatively a slightly smaller Goliath, and they are challenging each other before a river god, so a classical, certainly non-Christian, non-Jewish tradition. And then in the much larger middle zone, you're not seeing Goliath being slain, you are seeing Goliath looking as if he's going to win, and David has not even begun to throw his rocks, his slingshot, but you know what the result will be because his soldiers are very confident and Goliaths are already beginning to flee. And then at the bottom, suddenly you've got the right scale. A very tiny David is cutting off the head of a very large Goliath. And the slingshot is here and the three balls. So I always wonder whether the centami of the Ottoman world in some way goes back to this type of tradition. These were important when they were made. When we found them, they were written as being a gift of the emperor. Once they were decided not to be classical, then they wrote us it on the back. There was a silver stamp that was oraculous, so then they were made a gift of the emperor to the general who defeated the Persians for him. And the latest books argue that it's actually a very nice dinner tableware that you would have had in the middle of your elite dinner for the gentlemen who attended, not the ladies, to, at the end of dinner when they were sufficiently drunk, try to have conversations with each other only using phrases from the story of David. Because we know that there were dinners like that where you used words from the Iliad to show you were so sophisticated you knew all the words, and then you could twist them to fit your conversation that evening. As David is surviving on these elaborate plates in Constantinople, which will not fall to any invader until the Crusaders are let in 1204 by Byzantines, and then to the Ottomans in 1453. These southern lands that we've been looking at, Egypt, which is the breadbasket of the empire. When Heraclius goes to become emperor, his relative goes to make sure Egypt is loyal to Heraclius. Food shipped from Egypt is what feeds the poor of Constantinople. They cannot afford not to have it, and now they've lost it. They've lost all of the Eastern Mediterranean. And the new Muslim dynasty that is established are the Umayyads. And the point in Byzantium and Islam is that the Umayyads, as they take over, they have to use the local craftsmen. They are trying to make sure that the local people respect them, that a portion of the early origins of Islamic art are tied to the traditions of the Ptolemaic, Roman, Byzantine world that they are now inhabiting. And one of the easier ways to see it is this is the Emperor Heraclius and his co-emperors, his sons, in a gold coin, a solidus, which is what I'm wearing, which for more than half a millennium is the most accepted coin in the world. And even with the fall of these territories to Islam, it's not till the 13th century that the solidus is not the most widely accepted coin. And so you've got this new Umayyad state. It needs people to take its money. They won't take its money. So what does it do when their first efforts are not getting anywhere? It mints also in Damascus. This was minted in Damascus. These are minted in Damascus. They take Heraclius and keep the figures, but take the crosses and make them knobs. And they take the true cross that Heraclius saved from the Persians and brought back into the Byzantine Empire and housed in Constantinople, so that the most valuable gift of a Byzantine emperor to anyone was a portion of the true cross elegantly housed, and they turn it into a knob. So you've got the steps and you've got the vertical, but you just take off the cross arms, and I give it to you and it doesn't look that different from what you used to get, and it's gold, and it gets accepted. So it's the way in which you moved forward. And these new Umayyad rulers build a series of little palaces, or at least what survives is fairly little, and they're no longer elegantly decorated. So when you go to Jordan and you drive out to the edge of the desert, and for those of you who have been there, I just found it quite amazing when I was in Syria that you could drive down this highway, and on the left it was all green, and on the right it was all desert, as if the highway was built at the first step that you couldn't get water to grow crops. And these palaces are along kind of that same route. And at one of them, Casa Amra, all that survives is a bizarre-looking bathhouse. Bathhouses are something that goes back in antiquity, and they're big and important, and they are communal in many cases, and they are certainly signs of wealth and status. And a colleague of mine has just found the floor mosaics of the bathhouse, the first major bathhouse built in Constantinople. So it's a status thing to have. So at Casa Amra, you have an elegant bathhouse, and what we're looking at is one small portion of the decoration, which is a series of rulers. So it's as if this Al-Malik, I think is the one who has it, is convening those whom he feels are his peers, and they are identified by inscriptions. And this is almost certainly the Persian ruler with his crown. This is probably the Byzantine one. The king of Ethiopia is there. The Visigothic king of Spain. So you have made your way from the furthest western part of the Mediterranean basin, Spain, across to Jordan, and then there are a couple that are harder to identify, and the current assumption is that they represent the kings of India and China. So you have the end of the Silk Roads, Ethiopia, Persia, Byzantium, all the way across the Mediterranean to the other side as being the peers of these new rulers. It's not clear that anybody else thought that. And you have in a wonderful map of the 11th century in a manuscript that survives at Sinai, not the classical worldview, but the view of Cosmas Indicopleustes, a gentleman who was a spy for the Emperor Justinian, and who was probably a member of the Church of the East, or certainly very loyal to the idea that you couldn't accept classical ideas of science. So he has a very flat earth, and the winds are blowing the air, and every morning angels push the sun down, and at night they push the stars across the heaven. It's a completely wacky idea, but he does, that's quite useful to us, claim to have, perhaps did, travel from Alexandria to Sri Lanka. And he describes what is along the way. He describes in Sri Lanka that the ruler of Sri Lanka asked the people from a Byzantine ship and the people from a Persian ship which state is greater. and he brings out a coin and says, look, our coin is struck so much better than the Persian ones. We have better technology. We are the more powerful state. Now, whether that is something that really happened, or if, since he was a spy for Justinian, he maybe thought it was a nice thing to tell his ruler. But he does record a great deal of paths that we are not yet really studying enough. I listened to a scholar from Sri Lanka talking about how the really dinky little coins of Sri Lanka between the 2nd and the 4th century are based on the gold coins of Constantinople, because you're paying for black gold with gold coins. We know that Aksum is not only Christian in the sense of Constantinople, but in the 5th century, the army, the military, the navy of Constantinople provides ships which take the soldiers from Aksum across to Yemen, which they conquer. And as a symbol of having conquered the site, they convert the people to Christianity in the sense of the Church of Constantinople, which is, in its own mind, the universal church. And Catholicism is not yet broken away in any way. And they send from Constantinople mosaics and mosaic workers to decorate the apse of the Basilica Church that's built at Sana'a in Yemen, which is the largest Christian basilica outside of the Mediterranean basin. And that region remains Christian in the terms of Constantinople for many years, and then when they are conquered by the Persian side, the Church of the East takes over. So they remain Christian, just different Christians. And then it is argued that when Islam first begins in the 7th century, since clearly the reason you are a Christian in Sana'a is because you got beaten up, that they move rather quickly to Islam. And what they are all tracking are the silks that, in Charlemagne's term in Germany, have elephants on them. In a whole group that survive, have a man wrestling a lion, since many of them were found on Christian prelates buried in churches. We thought that it was Samson, because it would be Christian, but we actually don't know. It could just as easily have been Hercules, because when these objects come to the West, their meaning does not always come. And then in one of my favorites that a lot survive in, where the weaver's name is at the top, you have, in the tradition we've seen, a hunter on his horse, but he's got his little stick for his trained falcon to come, and what they are hunting is cranes in the marshes, and here's one of the foot soldiers that goes out and collects the dead cranes. Crane hunting is a very aristocratic sport in this world. And some, like this lattice pattern that's popular everywhere, they're auspicious, they're purple. Purple is the royal color. And the first Muslim fabric that we fully identify is this one on the right, that's written up extensively in Byzantium and Islam. It has embroidered, not woven, the name of a ruler from Tunisia in Africa. So maybe it was produced in Tunisia, maybe it was imported, and the embroidery added. It's the first taraz. Under Islamic rulers, you give elaborate fabrics with the name of the ruler embroidered, woven into them to favored figures. And when you get to European medieval ages, suddenly those taraz fabrics are appearing on the wardrobe of the Virgin Mary, which we are still trying to understand. But on this one, the piece was actually found in graves in Egypt that were also discovered in the late 1800s, and were incredibly exciting. And the latest study tells us that the yellow tones in his are from a berry that's from Central Asia. So you not only send silks, you send the dyes on these trade routes, and we cannot, unless the young woman who was doing her dissertation on this got more information after Byzantium and Islam, we're not sure whether you brought the silk to Tunisia from the Middle East because of the dye, or you brought the dye to somewhere else on the Mediterranean who made it, but it is an important issue. And in the Middle Ages, my Armenians that we'll do a show on next fall control trade routes from the mountains on the Mediterranean coast. And I love this Archbishop John because at this point, the Armenians control the trade routes for the Mongols, and the Mongols control from the Mediterranean to China. Different names, the Ilkhanids, the Yuan dynasty, but they're all relatives, and they've all come out of Mongolia. And he's got Chinese dragons on his liturgical robes, so he's reflecting the Chinese end of the silk trade they control. And in another image of him that we have, he's wearing French fleur-de-lis. And they are allies of the French. And what you need to remember is that when these travel, the motifs travel. So at Ravenna, when we were looking at the ladies of the court, she's wearing a scarf with this motif, and this is the same motif on a fragment of a scarf we have at the Met. We think what they do is ward off the evil eye, that they're such intricate patterns that you as an evil eye get lost in them and you can't get through them to the person that's wearing them. But these are grapevines and just geometric patterns. By the time of the tile that you all have, which is close to a millennium later, the shape, the superimposed squares has become much more clearly an 8-pointed star. And the decoration has become Arabic inscriptions about the prophet. But the sources come out of these traditions. And in the same way, you just can't imagine, we all like grapevines. I don't know whether it's because the way grapes used to be grown, in the winter they die down, and then suddenly they sprawl out of the earth, and you have belief that there will be another year. This is possibly made for Muslim use in the first generation. It's an inhabited vine. This one that's contemporary and maybe a similar workshop is clearly for Christian use because there's a cross. These censers, this one is definitely Christian, and this one in your collection is thought to be Muslim. So grapevines, as Christians, we take the phrase, I am the true vine, and make it a very specifically Christological thing, but Dionysus liked grapevines too. And the Armenians like them. So this floor mosaic, which looks like a lot of the floor mosaics I've been showing you all, is from right outside of the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. And the only reason we know it's Armenian is that way at the top, it's a little memorial chapel. And in Armenian, it says, for the souls of all those who have died. If it weren't there, we would make it anything. I do think, as I published many years ago, that it makes also a statement about the conversion of the Armenians in the face of Zoroastrianism, because the Zoroastrian faith believes that the souls of the dead go to heaven as birds. And this is the only floor mosaic I've ever found where every little grapevine is inhabited by some type of bird. And in the north, on my Armenian trade routes, the Silk Roads, in the 10th century, a king builds this palace church, and he repeats David and Goliath. And he also has David holding his rocks. But here, Saul, King Saul, the biblical Jewish king, is dressed like a Muslim ruler. And at the top of the church in the gables, this is St. John the Evangelist, and right below it, seated in what we think of as an Eastern pose, in an inhabited grapevine, is the Archrouni ruler who builds the site. And further south, back into my Jordanian world at Mashhata, you have a palace complex, so an equivalent to the Armenian one, and along the front wall, it's all these inhabited patterns, much of which is in the museum the Bode Museum in Berlin. And those are grapevines, they're the grapes, spilling out of vases in what we think of as the beginning of the arabesque of the Islamic world. The latest ideal, which I like a great deal, is that this side has only grapevines and this side is inhabited. And the old ideal was that right about there is a mosque, so you didn't put figures on the side that went with the mosque. But the latest idea by the retired director of the Bode Museum in Berlin is that this is a statement of Solomon, and that as Solomon is given dominion over the land and over the creatures of the land, this side is the land and the other side is the creatures. And I think there's a logic to that. In the middle of the palace, and here, you've got naked ladies, and we believe that most of that is new, so she was probably much more naked. This is early Islamic art. So the idea that Islam would have, in the beginning, rejective, figurative art does not quite hold up. But the other thing that has suddenly happened is that this should have been in my talk in the 7th century, but now they've found under some of the floor where they're doing archaeological dig 9th century coins. So it may be that we will have to change the dynasty that built it and what it was all for again. And all of those are serving Damascus, which is the center of the first Muslim dynasty, the Umayyads, who take the church, the Christian church that had dominated the city, and build a mosque there. The Christians had taken the classical temple that was there and built a Christian church on top of it, so it's a sequencing. And what you can see is that if it was just this, we would all be happy with it as a Christian church. But what's happened is that this is now, all of this is the entrance, and so the entrance has been moved to what we would think of as a side wall. And the area in front of it is filled with fantastic mosaics, which may have been made by people sent from Constantinople. The man who is supposed to have given the surrender keys of Damascus to the Muslim army as it arrived, his grandson would be St. John of Damascus, whom we know of for his writings in support of icons. And what we again tend to forget is that this is not a family that we would think of as from the center of the Byzantine world. They are in fact an Arab family of the region. But they are the governors of the Byzantine Empire and become similarly important in the early Umayyad years. And simply because I love it, I'm showing you. I think this would be a nice idea of what you would like to be in paradise. But this mosaic here is from Greece. And like the fountain of Theodora in Ravenna, you have this love of water and movement and the ability to get water as being important. And we all know that these Umayyads, at the end of the 6th century, build a site again on the site of another sacred space. So the Dome of the Rock is built on top of a platform that is already has a sacred significance. It too is filled with mosaics. It makes a very strong visual statement, so that every picture we see on TV of Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock is kind of the dominant thing, as you can see it here. And that's the Holy Sepulchre over there of the Christians. At the time it's built, Islam has not settled on Mecca, and Medina is the most holy sites of the Islamic world, and there's a strong effort to make Jerusalem the holiest site, because this is the site from which the prophet ascended into heaven. And in these years, as I come toward the end, back to what I said in the beginning, the text matter. And one idea is that the Aramaic text, this is from the book of Paul's in Peshitta, that the scribes who do those may be among the first to write down the sayings of the prophet, because the Quran is originally an oral tradition. It may also connect to Jewish scribes, because they're all writing in the same direction. But this is a more fluid style that is more comfortable with early Islamic Qurans. And the shape of this can be traced to similar books that are Christian text. This particular leaf that is from the David collection in Copenhagen may very well come from Qurans that were found stored because they were worn out in the Great Mosque in Yemen at Sana'a. And we know from texts that when these people are coming with this very good army and this new religion, that people say to them, so what's different about you from Christianity? Your books look the same. And early on, as with the piece you have here, the Quran takes the leaf and reorients it horizontally. So you've got something that is distinctively different. And you develop these quite beautiful scripts, which may never have been meant to be easily read. They may be mnemonic devices because you are supposed to recite the Quran, where you can tell where you should be in reciting them. So they are tied to in ways that we are again rediscovering. And one element of that we know about, in my next to the last slide, I will make my time schedule, is that the new religion of Christianity tried to look as good as the classical gods. The new religion of Islam wants to look as good as the religions they are replacing. They want buildings that are as honorific as the buildings of the people they're replacing. We saw coins in the beginning have to adapt to what they were replacing to be accepted. And one of the greatest set of gospels, there are several of these that survive, are these gospels whose, we would want to say they were made in Constantinople because they're dyed purple and they're written in gold and silver, but we actually have no proof of that. And it may be that Alexandria, Damascus, other rich cities would have made them, but they are extremely elegant. And they are thought to have inspired the Blue Quran, where you have dyed in indigo as opposed to purple. Then when you get into purple, there's the question of whether it's the most valuable purple, which comes from a shell, or made from a plant. And many of these are made from plants, which is one reason to think maybe they're not Constantinople. And a third group of blue dyed religious texts are the sutras from China. And I have a colleague who has argued that people with texts like this, fleeing from Ctesiphon and the Persian lands with the advance of the Muslims, we know a number of them went to China and to its capital, and that perhaps they took a gospel like this, which then made early Buddhism want to produce texts that were as glorious. What travels in ways that we haven't fully understood, and which I apologize for having given you all infinitely more dynasties in my reading list than I realized I could ever actually cover, are everybody wants knowledge in one way or another. This is a 6th, 7th century copy of the 1st century AD text, the Materia Medica, the medical listing of what plants and minerals will do for you, written by Dioscorides. That becomes very interesting when Maria Mavrudi, who's at Berkeley, studied them, what she was able to prove, because she is brilliantly able to read a variety of medieval languages that the rest of us can't do, was that the Arabic inscriptions on the ones that survive, which we always said, well, they're just writing down what it says in Greek, they are actually additions to the text. And one of the diseases that the original text did not discuss was measles. So often the addition is what you can use to treat measles. And then here, in this 13th century one, the text is in Arabic, and what you're seeing is what we think are two pupils bringing him their copies of his text. What we know is that this is an image that you copy from Christian Gospels, although this is almost certainly for Muslim use, and that the man who does the copying assigns himself as a Christian. So a question that I'm interested in is one aspect of what Christians in the region do is continue classical Greek learning in ways that make it useful to Muslim rule. And then here, in my final remarks before I answer questions, from a work in your collection, you have a work from Isfahan, on the wonders of creation from the middle 17th century. And it seemed to me to be a perfect place to end. It's yours. We're trying to learn. And Isfahan, in that time frame's international trade that would bring together there the marvels of creation, is totally dominated by the Armenians, who are given control of it by the Shah, and who run trade routes at that date that reach from the far edge of Western Europe and London and Amsterdam across the world, control the internal and external trade of India, and reach to Latin America. And at Jamestown, on the first ship of settlers that survived, include one Armenian named Martin. So, and they are all, what they are doing is they're finding silver and gold to bankroll the Shah by controlling his trade in silk, which is still one of the great trade routes and trade goods of the world. I hope I've made something that makes sense to you. I've had a great deal of pleasure talking to you, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you.